Twitch again. Happy Thursday in Europe. I'm going to be hosting the stream myself. I am Matt Line. Ordinarily, I would be joined by Steven Stutz or Ylva Thorbjörnsson, but both of them were busy, so we are going to go and do a bit of philosophizing. I'm going to be doing my best to interact with you guys in chat. That is, if I can wind up accessing the chat at all. We'll see how that whole thing turns out. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing all of you that decide to show up. All right. Well, our very first piece is one about the left and the right and Jordan Peterson. Now, am I milking this whole Jordan Peterson thing? Perhaps. But I do have a reason for it, and I do have an idea behind this this entire Jordan Peterson phenomenon, and I'd like to be able to discuss these matters with you to a greater extent than I've been able to do so in the past, due to the fact that I've had co-hosts who I haven't really wanted to compromise. Compromising co-hosts and making things difficult for them, especially if I know they wind up holding drastically different views than I have on certain matters when it comes to especially faith and religion and things of that nature, causes me to not want to put them in too difficult of a place, even though we do call sacred cows. Namely that I'd like them to be able to speak their piece and to be able to have their say. And simultaneously, I don't want it to devolve into a horrible situation wherein they might not feel inclined to say their views just due to the fact that it might differ from mine, and they want to be respectful. Because while we are calling sacred cows, we are being respectful toward each other. So I'll take this opportunity while streaming alone to say my piece a little bit more strongly than I otherwise would. I'll preface this by saying I don't particularly agree with Jordan Peterson on many things, and I don't disagree with him on many others. He's a man, he's a human, and he can but err. But he can also have stumbled on true things. So I think that we should first examine what it is that people are hearing from Jordan Peterson. And I'll actually let you know my opinion on the guy. So without further ado, let's take a look at this particular article. It's a philosophical piece by David Marcus on the Federalist. And he quite simply maintains the left and the right aren't hearing the same Jordan Peterson. A New York Times Magazine hit piece says more about the mainstream media than it says about Jordan Peterson. David writes, Dr. Jordan Peterson, who has enjoyed a surge into fame over the past year, has become a bit like the Yanni and Laurel audio meme. People listen to what he has to say, but disagree wildly about what they're hearing. Some hear a man with important ideas that can help people live a more fulfilling life. Others hear a dangerous misogynist who wants to set back the cause of liberated women, trans people, and the rest of the caste of oppression. In a feature for the New York Times Magazine this weekend, and this was back in May, Nellie Bowles clearly came down on the latter side. The first paragraph makes this obvious. Look back to the 1950s, he says. It's not clear from the article if this is a quote from Peterson. In any event, this interpretation has an essential mistake. When Peterson talks about changes in gender, sexuality, family, and work, he is exposing central contradictions, both evolutionary and social, that he believes are making people unhappy. He is not suggesting that all women should aspire to be a 1950s Donna Reed housewife, but that on many levels some women do want something closer to that lifestyle. Part of the evidence for this is that since the sexual revolution, the question of whether women can have it all has been so often on our tongues and pages. Peterson suggests the answer in many cases is no. He isn't telling women not to strive for whatever they want, or to be forced into anything, but that's the progressive narrative against him, one that the Times reinforced. A perfect example of this is Bowles' mischaracterization of Peterson's argument that societies are better off with enforced monogamy. Header: The Times got it wrong. The Times article makes it appear that Peterson means somehow women will be forced into sex they don't want to have, calling his ideas about enforced monogamy absurd. The reaction to that line has been swift and damning. But that's not what he's talking about at all. He's talking about societal norms that value monogamy and work to enforce it. He addressed this on Twitter this weekend. Furthermore, anyone motivated by the New York Times to assume that what I meant by enforced monogamy was anything other than social convention favoring stable pair bonding can think whatever they want, as they no doubt will anyway. And part of a very large anthropological psych literature indicating that monogamy makes men less violent. And it's interesting because there was one particular piece cited in a great deal of controversy over that. However, there are many other articles that do discuss that, and that whole monogamy making men less violent thing is probably going to be a discussion for another stream at some point. Likely another time that I wind up going solo here, seeing as out of all the people that are in our group, I think I'm the only married one. Or out of all the people that do streaming in our little clique, I'm the only married one. He, that is Jordan Peterson, also addressed it on his blog. My critics' abject ignorance of the relevant literature does not equate to evidence of my totalitarian or misogynist leanings. The important thing here is that Peterson assumed his interviewer was up on anthropological terms of art. That's never a good bet for journalists. We are mostly known for not paying for lunch. Peterson blames Bowles for not being familiar with the relevant literature. But enforced monogamy is not a well-known term of art, and it does sound menacing. Bowles probably should have asked for clarification before presenting it as absurd, but Peterson also has to know and anticipate that these kinds of attacks are going to be leveled at him by people who may be ill-informed in anthropology but nonetheless well-intentioned. Some of the confusion over just what Peterson means to propose is that most of his content is delivered verbally, either in lectures or interviews. Indeed, as is this case, once presented with someone's confusion, Peterson will often go to his blog to effectively explain the position. In writing, and especially editing, one thing an author does is actively anticipate misunderstanding and try to get ahead of it. This is much harder to do when talking off the cuff, especially if you're talking to people who agree with you. It allows you to brush past ideas you and the audience take for granted, that others might not. This, unfortunately, is a central theme of Peterson's style. It leaves him open to fair attacks. And before continuing on with this article, I have something to say regarding this, and this has to do more with the fact that I'm active on the Quora platform. And when I'm on Quora and I'm answering a question, as I have a tendency to do a few times a week, maybe more, it's easy to go and look at a question and say, okay, this is what the questioner is trying to elicit from the person they're trying to get an answer. And then it's even easier to go and say, well, and this is all the different ways that someone could possibly either misinterpret or deliberately misconstrue my words. And perhaps this is unwise of me to even say or to even think. Perhaps I should take more of a gentle approach to my writing. But I figure that if somebody hasn't gone and exposed himself to what would have, say, 150 years ago been basic knowledge, or what would have been just things that I would anticipate that people would by adulthood have heard or seen or experienced, that then unfortunately people, well, even though I can go and make these sorts of determinations, even though I can figure this sort of thing out, I oftentimes disregard that because it winds up taking what would be a very simple answer, perhaps even a yes or a no, and turning it into something considerably more complex, full of contingencies, full of different layers of abstraction, full of different ideas. It would be very multifaceted, multi-layered, and an exceedingly long answer. And so when I wind up having dozens of requests to answer questions in a day, I can't cover them all. So I'm forced to pick between quality and quantity. And giving a high quality answer is a tricky thing, because if you do give a high quality answer, then that also provides more material on a deeper level for people to discuss, and then you wind up getting a whole bunch of questions, then you wind up getting a whole bunch of feedback, and then it leads into this gigantic interaction, which I suppose is a good thing. And then if you wind up giving a simple thing, then people wind up trying to point out all the layers of subtlety that you missed, or pointing out things that you thought were implicit that they might not have. And I wonder how much of the burden of communication is on the communicator and how much of the burden is on the person to whom an idea is being communicated. Because it seems to me that people want to go and simply take a look at, okay, this is what this person said in this particular context, in this one article, in this one talk, in this one answer, in this one piece, and then not get a broader understanding of the context whence it came. So going back to Jordan Peterson, I would say that until recently I didn't really understand him. And the reason I would say that is because I hadn't been exposed to enough of his content to be able to have a clear picture of who the man was and what it was he was trying to do. So I would have a bunch of people coming up to me, in real life. We would just go and talk and say, oh, what do you think of this Jordan Peterson guy? And I might have seen one or two things, or heard one or two things, seen a whole bunch of other people's opinions on him, and I would just go and say, well, I don't actually know enough to have an informed opinion on Jordan Peterson. as far as I can see, there are things with which I agree that he says, things with which I disagree that he says, but overall I don't vilify him. And that has been my kind of go-to answer, because what I think of Jordan Peterson, or rather what I think of Jordan Peterson's views, vary widely depending upon what the actual perspective happens to be. But I have the intellectual honesty to be able to say that. And then I need to also realize that whatever it is I hear him say, I need to kind of look in the context of the other stuff somebody has said. And I think that people oftentimes jump to conclusions way too quickly before getting adequate information. And they go and make accusations before coming to the facts themselves, as if it were the responsibility of the other person to fill them in on all the requisite details, which would make every single discussion, I think, unnecessarily complex, due to the fact that the majority of each new discussion would be rehashing old points. Would be going back and saying the same thing over and over again. And if it's in the public domain, or at least if it's available publicly, if you can find it on YouTube, or you can find it on his blog, or you can find it wherever you might find it, then I would say that it would be the responsibility of the listener to at least get enough knowledge to be able to contextualize what a talker or a writer says. So this whole brushing past ideas that Peterson and the audience takes for granted thing, I think is perfectly okay. Because all it ever does is showcase the ignorance of people that haven't gone and figured things out. And it demonstrates the fact that their Overton window is very, very narrow. It demonstrates the fact that all they do is hear something that could conceivably be understood in a particular light. And then upon understanding that thing in that particular light, and getting all the different emotional connotations wrong and so on, leads to just the inevitable display of ignorance and poo throwing. Unfortunately, this ignorance is so widespread that the poo throwing has been normalized, as opposed to viewed with disdain as would have happened by any other generation, at least in the United States, to my understanding, except maybe beginning about 50 years ago. But at the risk of not addressing the situation fully, we'll continue with the article. What is our medium? Bowles derides Peterson as a YouTube philosopher. Okay, cutting and demeaning, but so what? What important philosopher who scribbles with a quill is he being compared to? What scary things does he say? That marriage and monogamy are good for society? If you think that is nonsense, okay, hashtag Tinder till 90 or whatever. Have sex with whomever you want, but be whatever gender you want, be no gender, be all genders, be the fulcrum of humanity the moment it changes. I get that appeal, but we are not that. At least we don't have to be. The central message Peterson sends is to reject postmodernism and the Marxism it embraces. I'm on board with that, with one small reservation. Postmodernism itself was a denial that science could tell us all. Philosophers like Frederick Jameson urged us to take ancient narratives more seriously. This is a central plank of Peterson's program, and one that we don't hear enough about in popular accounts of his work. In fact, much of Peterson's insistence that we listen to and understand our ancient myths, legends, and stories is not because they tell us how we should be, but because they tell us how we have been. These old narratives give us insight into what our ancestors thought about being human, where humanity had been, where humanity wanted to go. This is an essential tool for understanding Western thought and ideas, assuming we still wish to be human. David Marcus is the Federalist's New York correspondent and the artistic director of Blue Box World, a Brooklyn-based theater project. You can follow him on Twitter at Blue Box Dave. And this photo of Jordan Peterson is supposedly from Twitter. So with that all said, we can go and return to the point of people misrepresenting and mischaracterizing Peterson. Mischaracterization of someone with whom you don't necessarily agree is, to my understanding, pathetic. It's lazy, it's intellectual laziness, and of course I understand we only have a certain amount of intellectual resources that we can devote to things. But if you don't have intellectual resources that you can devote to things, the last thing you need to do is listen to Jordan Peterson. I mean, you might as well go and buy a bag of Cheetos, a bottle of Mountain Dew, and, I don't know, watch porn and whack off all day or something. Because I would say that in order to lead a good life, in order to be able to accomplish what you want to set out to do, you should be mindful. Now, mindfulness is important. And a big aspect of mindfulness is actually knowing and caring enough about what's going on in order to be able to have an educated opinion on the matter and allow it to influence your life appropriately. Now, educating yourself is important. Now, you don't need to educate yourself in useless things, but ultimately, if it has something to do with your happiness and your prosperity and so on, well, then that might be something worth knowing. And I would say Jordan Peterson, I mean, he doesn't know everything about it, but he's certainly more wise than well, most of the people in the mainstream media are, certainly. And his agenda is certainly a lot more noble. No, he's considerably further to the left, at least in the commonly understood U.S. political sense. But I would go and say he's far more an authoritarian socialist than I am. I'm a minarchist. I have the idea that people should be able to solve their own problems and that the government shouldn't particularly interfere all that much. Well, actually, at all. Except in cases where the individual is too small to solve a particular problem, and even then the government would only be able to use the exact same measure of force, for instance, that would be within an individual's right to use it in any given circumstance. And it seems to me that Jordan Peterson is, in that particular regard, more a conservative in the sense that he would wish to conserve a more social democratic / socialist societal structure as exists in Canada. Now, I may have overly simplified his position, and if you think I have, then please do let me know, because I don't want to go into and be nasty toward Jordan Peterson here, and I definitely don't want to mischaracterize his understanding of what should and should not happen on a governmental level. But I think that's a little bit, well, it's ancillary to the discussion. And the discussion is, of course, that people see what they want to see. And people's emotions color what it is that they read. And unfortunately, people have been coddled for so very long that they haven't learned to deal with cognitive dissonance properly. They haven't learned to deal with having multiple ideas in your head at the same time and dealing with the implications of, well, what if one of these ideas happens to be right? You know, instead of hearing an idea and realizing, oh, I might need to change my worldview, or I might need to research more, I might need to get a more nuanced understanding of the situation. I mean, it's pretty natural for people to go and take a dump and then immediately start crafting poo balls to throw at Peterson or at anybody that they view as a follower of Peterson. You're a follower of Peterson. What in the world are we talking about here? Well, either way, we move on to our next article. This is, again, about Peterson. This is about being dangerous. Jordan Peterson is right that you should become dangerous, and here's how, by James Morganelli. Recently, John Stossel interviewed psychology professor and internet sensation Jordan Peterson for Reason magazine to talk about the curious phenomenon surrounding his notoriety, that he advocates for seemingly difficult and even unpopular concepts like responsibility and truth. It's in responsibility that most people find the meaning that sustains them through life. It's not in happiness. It's not in impulsive pleasure, Peterson says. To adopt the responsibility for your own well-being and try to put your family together and to try to serve your community and try to seek for eternal truths and to live them. That's the sort of thing that can ground you in your life enough so that you can withstand the difficulty of life. But the interview takes a turn after Peterson says it's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world. Stossel scoffs. Competent and dangerous? Why dangerous? There's nothing to you otherwise, Peterson replies. If you're not a formidable force, there's no morality in your self-control. If you're incapable of violence, not being violent isn't a virtue. People who teach martial arts know this full well. If you learn martial arts, you learn to be dangerous, but simultaneously you learn to control it. Life is a very difficult process, and you're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. Stossel counters, by dangerous, that implies I should be ready to threaten someone, to hurt somebody. No, you should be capable of it, but that doesn't mean you should use it, Peterson finishes. As an ethicist and martial arts teacher, I can attest that Peterson is correct. His point regarding virtue is not only logical, it is commonsensibly true. We cannot be virtuous in a particular endeavor if we are incapable of actually accomplishing it. The virtue stems from the fact that we are competent first, without which no virtue can be achieved. Sacred things are worth defense. That requires strength. Pacifists, who believe life is so sacred no violence should ever be visited upon it, contradict themselves if they are unwilling to protect or defend themselves or others from harm. For if life is truly sacred, then it ought to be protected and defended, even by violence. However, let's not get confused. Some might argue from all this that a criminal who is adept at violence and chooses not to leverage it against others is just as virtuous then, as the person trained in the use of violence who defends an innocent person from attack. This is wrong. Choosing not to do the wrong thing is not the same as choosing to do the right thing. Virtue is moral excellence, as it reaches toward the good. This is why Peterson's point is actually much deeper. Being competently dangerous is not enough. We also need to be specifically ethical in its practice, which means justifiable in the use of violence. Peterson's statement, but that doesn't mean you should use it, is the normative stamp on the doctor's counsel. This moral feature should not be overlooked or taken for granted, and for a simple reason. Man is fallen. The human condition is a dark landscape that bears few lights that we must choose to orient ourselves toward. With power comes responsibility. There is a sexiness associated with being dangerous for the same reasons people are attracted to action, mobster, and comic hero archetypes. Human beings are primevally obsessed with the application of physical power over themselves and others. When one attains such power and becomes proficient, such as through martial training, there is an inherent obligation, a burden even, to learn to wield it wisely. Without a prudential sense of when to act and how, there can be great difficulty in determining whether we ought to act at all. This aspect cuts both ways. We might act when we should not, or not act when we should. There may be grave consequences at both ends. Thus, in the training and usage of violence to become a dangerous person, the application of justifiable force must be carefully studied and, more importantly, inculcated throughout. Without it, techniques, tactics, and the strategies that rule them are merely hammers looking for heads. This leads to the question of questions. Why ought I act? Competency and dangerousness are both ruled by the deep-seated understanding of motive that most people ignore to their detriment. Here is a true-life example. A young man went to the aid of a young woman who was being beaten. This fellow thwarted the attack by attacking her attacker, but unbeknownst to our hero, the aggressor's friends were not far behind. And when they came upon their comrade receiving a knuckle sandwich, they served up several of their own. Whatever happened to the girl is anyone's guess. Question. Did the hero do the right thing? He saw the violence and knew it was wrong. The young lady did not deserve to be beaten by a cretin. Our hero, a trained martial artist, took the bully out. Now, had the violence stopped at that point, perhaps he could have tipped his hat and walked into the sunset. But the question remains, did his dangerous action provide him with the best option to stop the violence and prevent more? We can be dangerous without being ethical. It's easy, really, far easier than being both for sure. Even though our hero had approached and ambushed unseen from the rear, he had not acted on the ethical first. If he had, he would have given himself the best opportunity for the outcome he was initially compelled to effect. Let's remember why he intervened to begin with. It wasn't to deliver justice to the villain and tie him up with a note for the cops. He did it to protect a young woman who could not protect herself. Why then did he choose a tactic that endeavored the former and neglected the latter? Once the aggressor's friends attacked our hero, it created a new issue. Now he needed defending, and the young woman was left in the very same predicament our hero found her in to begin with, at the mercy of those who meant her harm. By unnecessarily attacking the attacker, the hero placed himself, the girl, and even his attackers in potentially deadly harm. Yes, even his attackers. Had the hero or someone else been carrying a concealed firearm, it might have turned into a turkey shootout, or into a turkey shoot with no turkeys. Here's a more responsible approach to attempted heroism. What should the hero have done? He ought to have placed himself between the young woman and her abuser and separated them. This ethical action is also the best tactical option as it protects everyone. By standing up for the girl, he becomes a guardian to protect her from further violence. By not immediately attacking the attacker, our hero protects himself because the attacker isn't forced into a fight. Fighting becomes a choice the attacker has to make. It also protects the attacker from harm by the hero as well as harm he may incur to himself as a result of his own poor behavior. Tactical options on their own are devoid of meaning without orientation. Choking out someone from behind is simply a procedure. The technique gains priority and consequence only when aiming toward the good, which in the context of the ethical use of violence is always moral physical. That is why I would advocate to define Peterson's dangerous as acting as an honorable and vigilant protector of self and others, including the enemy if at all possible. Protecting self and others can certainly be challenging, but protecting an enemy is absolutely the most difficult and dangerous thing anyone can attempt. Doing so doesn't just speak to expert competency, but also to a moral maturity by a remarkable willingness to self-risk for others, because there is no higher ethical standard in using violence than to subdue an enemy without killing him. True wisdom results from the ethical use of knowledge, so becoming a competently dangerous person ought to be affixed to a protector-driven physical philosophy, so one is able to do the right thing in the right way at the right time for the right reasons. James V. Morganelli is a writer, teacher, and trainer. He holds a master's degree in applied ethics from Loyola University, Chicago, and has 40 years of training in Eastern martial arts. He is the author of The Protector Ethic, Morality, Virtue, and Ethics in the Martial Way, scheduled for release in May 2018. He lives in Chicago. I don't understand the possessive here. Jordan Peterson is right that you should become dangerous, and here's how. But whatever. moving on to the point, the whole idea of there being an objective system of morals, the whole idea that preservation of the life of another is important, the whole idea that one should work to minimize harm, for instance, in a situation that's already gone bad, you should still seek to have an optimal outcome. All of this is something that cannot be necessarily understood in the lens of moral relativism. There's this whole discussion is predicated upon the existence of absolute morals, which is yet another difficulty that we run into. Another one of these implicit assumptions that one would assume that people could gather by looking at, say, what Peterson says or what this author here says. But apparently it's not. Because when you wind up getting into discussions about this, they quickly turn into a morally relativistic smackdown in which people start arguing about, well, what is it that we should pursue as good? These are questions that, especially in Western society, if asked some generations ago, wouldn't have even elicited too much discussion, because the answer would have been viewed as obvious, and that was because most of Western the values of Western civilization were predicated upon a Judeo-Christian set of values. And the Judeo-Christian set of values, which is interesting that people view it this way nowadays, is not at all weak. It's not about being weak. It's not about being a pacifist. But there is an element of responsibility in there. There is an element of you get the dichotomy. When someone slaps you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. Well, what does that mean? And then contrast that with, well, I didn't come to bring peace, but I came to bring a sword, and to divide and to divide the family, and so on. So how do you understand that? Well, there are elements of you can't have mercy without being just, for example. If you do not have justice and the ability to carry it out, the virtue of mercy is meaningless. Mercy is weak. Mercy is meaningless if you're weak. Mercy contains meaning only when, for instance, the perpetrator knows he is in the wrong. A perpetrator knows that he would be able to, or he would be forced into, receiving some sort of a bad consequence for his action at the hands of another. And then when the other chooses not to act in that way, that is mercy. Now, if this other person happens to not be in a position of power, if this person happens to not have any clout whatsoever, then a merciful act from this person is meaningless. And this comes from the same exact position that this article comes from. But I think that we've talked about Peterson enough. We've been streaming for nearly 40 minutes, and almost the entire time was dedicated toward discussing Peterson to some extent or another. So, we have another piece about the left's war on words. And I think this is kind of an important place to start. So we're going to go how the left's war on words manipulates your mind. what's wrong with using solely reason to undergird a political philosophy, and how the theory of white privilege leads to socialism. So the author contends here that words can now literally be defined with their antonym. We are a hair's width and an ounce of stupidity away from war is peace. Freedom is slavery. Whether we are communicating something simple, like a restaurant order, or something complex, like a tax code, we expect others to understand. Language provides an avenue to express shared meaning so humans can relate to one another. On college campuses, social media, and in the courts, this shared meaning is being destroyed. Through linguistic activism, leftists have begun a full-scale war on language, playing by their own set of constantly shifting rules. I don't know when it started or with what word, but the modern American lexicon is changing faster than society can keep up. Any 20th century liberal who walked onto a college campus today would be more confused than the town drunk from Babel straggling into town the morning after a bender. Words can now literally be defined with their antonym. We are a hair's width and an ounce of stupidity away from war is peace. Freedom is slavery. Word games take many forms, and honest people must call it out. At Prager University, Michael Knowles exposes this tactic and how it affects the culture. Underlying each tactic is misuse of words. This isn't innocent linguistic drift or slang. It's a conscious effort to reshape society. The schemes include redefining words for personal gain, using modifiers to alter the meaning of a word, replacing technical words with colloquial ones, and creating new words. Each of these is a bullying tactic which distorts effective discourse. What do these tactics look like? It starts with misusing words or defining them based on circumstance rather than objective meaning. The entire purpose of defined language is to hold constant meaning so others can understand. Situational use starts to condition how people feel about words, building up a new connotation. The classic example is the word liberal, which the far left co-opted. It was adopted because of its positive connotation and used as cover for imposing greater leftist control under the guise of liberty. In reality, there is nothing liberal about failing to protect life, burdening individuals with regulations and taxes, or forcing individuals to provide services to others. This is no accidental misnomer, but strategic messaging to influence people. Who doesn't want to support a policy that's progressive, pro-choice, or affordable? When the word cannot be flipped, other words are sometimes added to suggest a new meaning. In the case of firearms, the new popular phrase is assault rifle. Webster's dictionary was happy to update its definition to help society in the right direction. The effect is a stronger connotation which plays on people's emotion and visceral reactions to the phrase. Tinkering with language and misusing words results in opinion polls in which 92% of people support universal background checks without realizing that would prevent a friend or family member from selling or trading a gun privately. Modifiers that draw emotion can effectively shape new public policy based on feelings and not objective facts. Following very closely is substituting words to suit the political narrative. The play here is almost always to swap out the legal or technical word for the connotation from casual conversation. While assault rifle is one example, a more explosive one is terrorism. The word has a legal definition, which is anchored in the actor's beliefs and intentions, not others' outcomes or perceptions. In general conversation, however, it simply means something causing terror or great violence. A crowd of leftists will cry foul when a white male is not immediately labeled a terrorist following any abhorrent crime before facts are known. This tactic combines several others, because it suggests that Republicans and conservatives are selectively using the term against Islamic extremists. Except that many on the right were quick to label the Charleston shooter a domestic terrorist. And while the motive of the recent Las Vegas shooter remains unknown, conservatives labeled him with nuance from the available information. In reality, this is a sleight of hand, because it is the leftists selectively labeling. Violent and excessive killing does not become terrorism because a leftist feels it should be labeled such. Social media outrage is not the worst effect of this definition swap. Former FBI Director James Comey infamously reframed the Hillary Clinton investigation by referring to it as a matter. When it is convenient, activists drop technical language and improperly replace it with imprecise and milder words. This shouldn't fool anyone and deserves a forceful rebuttal. Another sleight of hand is the phrase, undocumented immigrant in place of illegal alien. The rallying cry is that no person is illegal, but of course illegal refers to the action and status, not the personhood of the individual. An alien is the technical term for a foreign citizen. Senator Kamala Harris pushed this tactic further in a 2017 tweet saying, "An undocumented immigrant is not a criminal. The problem is that by definition, to be an undocumented immigrant is necessarily to break a law. These word games are not just misleading, they're often blatant lies." Wholly disassociating words from their accepted meaning opened an entirely new realm of possibility for leftists. By separating gender from sex, linguistic activities tore the very fabric of mutual understanding and created a new class of victims, and by definition, a new class of offenders. Pronouns, the simplest way to identify another party, are now subject to feelings. Defining words on subjective views defeats the purpose of language because it creates an endless guessing game and empowers the other party to choose when to reward and when to punish the speaker. By sabotaging the accepted unity of sex and gender, dozens of new pronouns sprang into existence. New words do not harm discourse unless they are thrust upon people and enforced through speech codes. Controlling how people speak is the implicit goal of this movement, which combined with anti-hate speech activism, seeks to empower the left as the arbiters of morality and to punish those who wrongfully use language, ironically achieved by abusing language themselves. Why is this so important? The left does not have to rely on judicial activism when it can brainwash an entire population by changing how they think of and describe policy. A whole generation raised to think that well-regulated means the same thing as government inspected and approved can destroy the Second Amendment. Words do change meaning over time, which is why this issue is so important. The judicial philosophies of originalism and textualism emphasize the importance of words because they convey valuable meaning. The importance of these philosophies, however, is that they rely on what words meant to the public when they were used. To impose the current leftist linguistic strategy would mean that over time laws do not need to change, if the words in those laws can simply evolve meaning. In reality, a statute's meaning is frozen with the public meaning of the words when it passed. It is essential to critically evaluate what words mean and the context in which they are used. When colloquial words are words are improperly elevated, and legal and technical words are degraded to irrelevance, the interpreter is the only arbiter of meaning. Judges already hold this trust, but if they are unbound from the public meaning of words, they are no better than tyrants acting on subjective whim. The righteous aim of the American experiment was to create a nation of laws, not of men. Today, written law is not supreme, because words themselves are decaying. Judges can decide on meaning. Politicians can misuse words with abandon. And activists can weaponize linguistic drift to brainwash uneducated voters. The pen is truly mightier than the sword. The power to influence language is the power to create and destroy, and it must be checked. And I highly doubt that Benjamin meant that it must be regulated by the government. I think that it's a moral responsibility. Benjamin Dierker is a law student at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. He holds a master's degree in public administration and a bachelor's degree in economics, both from Texas A&M University. He is a Christian and a Texan and loves to talk about both. So this whole situation involving arguing semantics is horrible. In fact, I find myself quite often in conversation with people who know full well what's intended by words. And then still choose to pick a different meaning just because it suits their purposes. Now, I can understand in the case of actual ambiguity, this whole I can understand if something is actually ambiguous, you might want to clarify. But I think a lot of this boils down to sophistry. Like, rather than dealing with actual ideas, rather than looking at things that have merit, rather than attempting to deal with the essence of things, people prefer to play superfluous, useless word games. Although one might argue that these word games aren't necessarily useless, due to the fact that people use the ability to change the definition of words or the ability to redefine things as merely a tool in the arsenal of being able to get their way, which is, in their minds at least, quite supreme to the things such as truth. Now, interestingly, I would say that if you're having trouble with truth, or if you're having a trouble with accepting things for the way that they are, that's a personal problem. And, it's an awful lot easier to deal with a cognitive dissonance by trying to make everyone else change than by changing yourself. Appealing to the hive mind, appealing to the mob mentality, appealing to the group. Trying to make it seem like everybody goes and thinks something else even though that's not the case. And slowly enacting social change based upon that. Attempting to use the power of the government to go and redefine words. And the power of repetition to enforce it, as opposed to letting words change definition organically, is a tremendous disservice to people that use language every day and count on there to be consistent meanings in order to be able to have meaningful interaction with other people. in order to be able to be fair to everyone. Because if we're changing the definition of words, it's not going to be fair to anyone, because nobody can ever count on even something so simple as having a yes mean yes and a no mean no. If you ask me, do you like coffee? And I answer you, yes, I like coffee. Drinking coffee here, I like it with a little salt and milk and no sugar. And let's say 5 years down the road, the definition of coffee, salt, milk, and sugar have all changed. You've gone and turned my yes into I don't know what. Because I don't know what coffee is anymore. I don't know what milk is. I don't know what sugar is. I don't know what salt is. If something so simple as the definition of coffee changes, that doesn't mean that I don't like coffee. It means that whoever changed the definition of the word coffee is an idiot. You know, there is no benign reason to change the definition of the word coffee. I mean, there may be trolling, for instance, but that's just stupid. The only reason to do that would be to have an impact on everybody that goes and drinks coffee and uses the word coffee. Similar to how here in Finland, well over a decade ago now, they came up with a law that said, unless a product is 100% butter, you can't even have the word butter in the name of it. So there's this product that was essentially a mixture of butter and margarine, voimarini, and because it has the letters VOI, voi, in it, because it has the letters for butter, the company who made this stuff was legally required to change the name of it to oivarini, or just something else. They chose oivarini. Now, why? Why? It's like, okay, the thing contains butter. The word has butter in it. What's the problem? Well, the problem is somebody made a blanket statement compelling a certain kind of speech. Like, how in the world am I supposed to tell you about this? How am I supposed to convey to you that I have a container that has butter and margarine in it, and at particular proportions, if I can't use the word butter to describe what's in it, or in the name? It's stupid. That's absolutely stupid. So why in the world would it be any more smart for us to say, well, the definition of justice can change over time, or the definition of fairness can change over time, or the definition of, I don't know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness can change over time? The definition of unalienable can change over time. I mean, if it's stupid to change the definition of coffee due to the fact that it impacts interaction, how much more stupid is it to change the definition of words that make up the very fabric of society? I mean, I can't think of any benign reason for doing this. It all is malignant at the core. And it was quite disconcerting to me. So yes, the left's war on words manipulates our minds, and we have to be very careful. And we have to be clear as to what it is that we're trying to say. To some extent, we're stuck with whatever words other people use, because there's still this idea of common understanding, but that means that we have to very, very carefully do an exposition of everything, past and present, in order to be able to make sure that we have some sort of meaningful discussion. Because if people don't understand what the original intent of words were, then all of the good things that are predicated upon these can be twisted, converted potentially into bad things. I don't know about you, but that's definitely not what I want. And I think that a lot of this happens due to the fact that we play games. We play games. We think that, and perhaps this is a bit of a jump, but the whole idea that I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, is a load of horse crap. As if cognition and existence are the only... No. 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 Does that mean a comatose person doesn't exist? Does that mean someone below a certain age, let's say in a particular period of gestation, doesn't exist? Does that mean that other animals... Does it mean certain animals do not exist because they predominantly rely upon, or they exist to a lesser extent due to the fact that they rely predominantly upon instinct and don't have the same kind of cerebrum? I mean, it's stupid. It's absolutely asinine. It's absolutely stupid, and I don't understand why people let that kind of thinking rule their lives. But no, this whole lovely bunny trail goes and has changed the course of human history. In some aspects for the better, I would say, because people understood the value of science and so on, but in some aspects for the worse, because having an understanding of the quantitative does not at all mean that we have an understanding of the qualitative. Science can tell you how to build a nuke, it can't tell you whether to use it. Science can tell you how to make an antibiotic, but it can't tell you whether to use it. Oh, if we use this antibiotic in this particular scenario, we might go and make a bacteria completely resistant to this, which could be, detrimental to everybody. What should one's goals be? What should one's aspirations be? What should people aim at? Science can't tell you that. But still, the idea that solely reason should undergird political philosophy has been around for, well, centuries. And it's, well, to me, disconcerting. So anyhow, without further ado, what's wrong with using solely reason to undergird a political philosophy? Conservatives and libertarians must confront the Enlightenment's failures and address the philosophical triumph of its critics. Martin Luther once declared, "Reason is a whore." Despite rumors, the cult of reason, a state religion established during the French Revolution, probably did not make this literally true during its Festival of Reason. The women crowned as goddesses of liberty and reason throughout France, including in Notre Dame Cathedral, may not have been actual prostitutes. But a debate between several fellow Federalist writers still raises the question: how do we know that what we call reason is not just a trollop servicing desire, a tarted-up mask over our will to power? Furthermore, is the Enlightenment really the standard bearer for rationality, with irrationality and relativism the alternatives, or are there other better options available? The exchange began with my, meaning Nathaniel Blake's, and John Davidson's separate but overlapping critiques of the Enlightenment, and Jonah Goldberg's new book Suicide of the West. Aaron Gleason has defended Goldberg from our criticisms, and Robert Drasinski responded to Davidson with a robust defense of the Enlightenment. I stand by my mostly positive review of Goldberg's work, but would like to focus on Drasinski's piece, which I think contains the most substantial disagreements to explore. Drasinski credits the Enlightenment for the prosperity, freedom, and peace that have developed, however fitfully, over the last few centuries. But this gives far too much credit to a movement that was deeply ungrateful for the accomplishments that came before it, and upon which its own achievements were constructed. Drasinski's case also overlooks necessary distinctions between different strands of the Enlightenment. For instance, although it is commonplace for intellectual historians to distinguish the Scottish Enlightenment from the broader European Enlightenment, there are no such differentiations in Drasinski's essay. He simply ignored the continental side of the Enlightenment, which was more arrogant and less tempered by Christianity and tradition than that of the British Isles. The Enlightenment was complex, and there is space for debate over precisely how to delineate it, but to speak of it without discussing its continental contributors is historical malpractice. Which is interesting, because if we go and we talk about, for instance, the Scottish Enlightenment, an awful lot of the classical liberal culture found in the early United States was predicated upon the Scottish Enlightenment. But that is also a subject for another discussion. Neglecting to untangle the different threads of the Enlightenment vitiates Drasinski's efforts to disassociate the French Revolution from the Enlightenment. He contends that the revolutionaries were drunk on Rousseau, who was in many ways a counter-Enlightenment figure, and many of them were. But many of the same revolutionaries were also intoxicated by the Enlightenment. They liked Rousseau. They also established a literal cult of reason. What had happened was not a rejection of the Enlightenment, rather its arrogance and failures had called forth an antithesis that led to a dreadful synthesis that sought the violent liberation of mankind from all that had come before. It was different in the United States, which tempered an already moderate strain of the Enlightenment. The peace and prosperity we enjoy is not due wholly or even primarily to the Enlightenment, but to factors that preceded it. Our nation had prospered from a heritage that includes some Adam Smith and John Locke, but also a lot of Christianity, some classical influences, and a long history of common law and representative self-government. I'm going to read this again, because this is incredibly important to understand if our goal is constructing a good society. It was different in the United States, which tempered an already moderate strain of the Enlightenment. The peace and prosperity we enjoy is not due wholly, or even primarily, to the Enlightenment, but to factors that preceded it. Our nation has prospered from a heritage that includes some Adam Smith and John Locke, but also a lot of Christianity, some classical influences, and a long history of common law and representative self-government. We benefited from the moderation of those such as Washington and Adams, while avoiding the excesses of, say, Thomas Paine, or the sillier ideas of even so important a figure as Jefferson. Americans rejected George III and his Parliament less out of a revolutionary ideology than out of a determination to preserve a heritage of ordered liberty against encroachment. In contrast, Enlightenment thinkers saw tradition as slavery to prejudice and superstition, and placed great faith in their human reason to perceive the world accurately and solve problems within it. Diderot wrote that philosophy is advancing with gigantic strides. We are beginning to shake off the yoke of authority and tradition in order to hold fast to the laws of reason. He added that the world has long awaited a reasoning age where the rules would be sought no longer in the classical authors but in nature. Reason would emancipate mankind from the chains of the past and improve the human lot. Following the lead of early modernity, many Enlightenment figures were entranced by the ideal of rationalizing human affairs. Natural science seemed to provide a model for all knowledge, including that of human culture, politics, and morals. Many Enlightenment writers were enamored of the idea that if the natural laws that rule human affairs could be understood, then governance could be like geometry and morality like the rules of mathematics. This confidence that human reason could apprehend and regulate other aspects of life as it did the natural sciences was mistaken. Philosophically, it proved impossible to provide a universal, impersonal standard of rationality accessible to all persons, a failure that has led to centuries of epistemological wrangling. Successive stages of Enlightenment philosophy dethroned their predecessors, and were then discredited in turn. These progressive failures to secure a standard of rationality eventually led to the abandonment of reason in favor of subjectivism and relativism. By claiming too much for human reason, the Enlightenment paved the way for those who would dismiss it entirely. Which goes back to our whole idea of postmodernism, which is, as Mr. Caleb Beers would like to point out, a necessary consequence of, in other words, the death throes of modernism. Practically, the hubris of the Enlightenment led to many disasters, as revolutionaries presumed that destroying the status quo was righteous and liberating, and central planners presumed their ability to rationally organize society. This confidence in human reason is almost inexorably centralizing. The triumph of reason in human affairs means that the rational understanding of society will be followed by rationally organizing society. If the means to human happiness and prosperity can be rationally known, then those who have apprehended them ought to work to implement them. Society will be rationally governed, and wrongs, such as persistent inequality, will be remedied. Thus, Condorcet enthusiastically predicted the eventual triumph of real equality, the final end of the social art, in which even the effects of the natural differences between men will be mitigated, and the only kind of inequality to persist will be that which is in the interests of all. That is why, despite Tuschinski's protestations, communism is fundamentally an Enlightenment project. It adheres to the Enlightenment agenda of the scientific understanding of human affairs, and the prospect of human control over our destiny. Marxism, eugenics, command economics, progressivism, and positivism are all premised upon the vision of a rational, scientific understanding and direction of human society. They may be failed attempts, but they are still efforts to instantiate the Enlightenment ideal of rational, scientific societies. And if they were irrational, that only directs us back to the Enlightenment's fundamental failure to adequately define and defend rationality. The Enlightenment's claim, repeated by Tuschinski, to represent rationality perpetuates a false dichotomy. The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre has observed that the tendency to present an either-or between Enlightenment rationalism on one hand and relativism on the other obscures other possibilities. The philosophical failure of Enlightenment rationalism need not lead us to embrace the likes of Rousseau or Nietzsche, for there are many other alternatives available drawn from ancient, medieval, and even modern sources, to say nothing of non-Western philosophical approaches. Thus, some of my scholarship, such as a chapter in this collection, has focused on the work of MacIntyre and Hans-Georg Gadamer, both of whom rejected as illusory the Enlightenment idea of ahistorical universal truth. They emphasized that human rationality must operate historically within the contingency and finitude of our existence. Yet this does not preclude the possibility of truth, but establishes the condition under which we may apprehend it. And there are a multitude of other philosophers and scholars who have rejected much or all of the Enlightenment without rejecting reason and truth. For example, one of the great achievements of economics has been the realization that the dream of scientifically and rationally planning an economy is impossible. The Austrian school of economics, especially Hayek, has shown the limits of rationality applied to complex economic systems. But that this does not comport with the Enlightenment goal of rational understanding and control of society does not mean that it's not rational. Rather, it means that the often dominant branches of the Enlightenment that aimed at scientific understanding and control over society had a mistaken understanding of rationality. Somewhere between the grandiose schemes of Enlightenment rationality and the grandiloquent rejection of reason by the Romantic counter-Enlightenment there is room for genuine human reason to operate, limited, humble, and imperfect, but nonetheless real and salutary. Some strands of the Enlightenment are part of our heritage, but we should appreciate how they were integrated into older and wiser philosophical, political, and religious traditions. Appealing to the Enlightenment without such nuance is folly in both philosophy and politics. Rather than uncritically embracing the Enlightenment, we must consider why it failed when deprived of the support of the older traditions it rejected. In particular, we must address the failure of its claims to rationality, which have proven disastrous outside of the natural sciences. Far from appearing self-evident, the claims of Enlightenment thinkers to provide timeless rational truths now seem provincial, thoroughgoing products of their time. Neither Trzcinski nor Jonah Goldberg, whose book provoked this discussion, is a moral relativist, but they will not be able to rebut moral relativism and postmodernism by retreating to the Enlightenment and repeating its arguments. To succeed, conservatives and libertarians must confront the Enlightenment's failures and address the philosophical triumph of its critics. For instance, it is futile to address Nietzsche and his postmodern offspring with the worn Enlightenment cliches that he so deftly dissected. The Enlightenment undermined itself through hubris and hatred for tradition, and Nietzsche danced upon the ruins. If there's anything good to be preserved from the wreckage, it will be saved only by acknowledging the limitations of human reason and the necessity for reliance upon tradition. That is, only through the virtue most antithetical to Enlightenment thinkers: humility. Nathaniel Blake has a PhD in political theory, and he lives in Missouri. And although I do not make a penny off of doing this, I would actually say that both due to the word choice here and especially due to the content, have a lovely fellow YouTuber by the name of Caleb Beers. And he well, let's just put it this way. His streams, he has live streams on Friday and Saturday from 2 o'clock p.m. onward, Eastern Time. And there's this ongoing joke that it's not a stream unless we've gone and taken a dump on modernity. And I would highly recommend seeing that. When I wind up putting this on YouTube, I'm going to leave a link to his channel in the description. Additionally, he's written a book entitled Hubris, which I highly recommend you pick up and read. It's, by the standards of the 21st century, very heavy reading, but it's something that people, in the 19th century would have been able to get through with relatively little difficulty. So I would highly suggest checking out Caleb Beers, as well as checking out the ancient philosophers. Anyhow, we have one more. It's already an hour and 18 minutes into the stream. So now is about time to go to the meditations. We won't be able to talk about white privilege and socialism yet. But here we go. One of the meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Unfortunately, I don't know if I can get the well, either way, I will go back to our original layout and do a little bit of do a little bit of reading, and I will include the link to this in the description. This is the first book of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. We go to what he learned from Sextus, a benevolent disposition. He learned a benevolent disposition in the example of a family governed in a fatherly manner, the idea of living conformably to nature and gravity without affectation, and to look carefully after the interest of friends, and to tolerate ignorant persons, and those who form opinions without consideration. He, Sextus, had the power of readily accommodating himself to all, so that intercourse with him was more agreeable than any flattery, and at the same time he was most highly venerated by those who associated with him, and he had the faculty both of discovering and ordering, in an intelligent and methodical way, the principles necessary for life. And he never showed anger or any other passion, but was entirely free from passion, and also most affectionate. And he could express approbation without noisy display, and he possessed much knowledge without ostentation. These are, in today's society, very, very rare traits. A benevolent disposition. How many people do you know that are truly benevolent? How many families are governed in a fatherly manner? How many people do live conformably to nature? How many people's lives espouse gravity without affectation? How many look carefully after the interest of friends? How many tolerate ignorant persons and those who form opinions without consideration? This one hits me hard. This one hits me very hard. This is an area of personal weakness for me. Over a decade ago, I would have conversations with people, and I found myself more recently being less and less willing to do so. Tolerating ignorant persons doesn't mean agreeing with their ignorance, but it does have an awful lot to do with one's attitude toward them. One of forbearance, understanding, so on. Accommodating himself to all, so that intercourse with him was more agreeable than any flattery. And at the same time, he was most highly venerated by those associated with him. And he had the faculty both of discovering and ordering, in an intelligent and methodical way, the principles necessary for life. And I'll admit that when I was in university, I used to do this a lot more than I do now. And I would say that part of it has to do with the fact that I had far greater hope in humanity than that I do now. Unfortunately, living amongst the adults that I've lived with, I've developed a great distrust of many people. When I go and I see people making poor decisions, I immediately start imputing them to malice. I'm very, very libertarian in my outlook on things, for instance. And anytime that I see people advocating for the use of the government in a certain way, I immediately think that, well, these are the kinds of people that, given the opportunity, would be violent. Given the opportunity to do that with impunity. But maybe we all would. I view the use of the government as a occasionally necessary evil. It should be as minimal as possible. And I view acts by the government as, well, I mean, ultimately, it's predicated upon their monopoly to use force. And if someone else has a monopoly to use force on my life, and somebody else is advocating that a government policy should be made on something, then the natural conclusion is that government should be allowed to tell me what to do, to force me what to do, in accordance with the will of either, a monarch, or an aristocracy, or um, a democracy. So, like, 51% of the people should be able to tell 49% of the people what to do. I mean, this line of thinking is absurd, because no matter what occurs, I mean, this due to human nature being what it is, it leads to despotism. So, am I supposed to think that people are a bunch of horrible despots under the surface, constrained only by, social norms? Or am I supposed to just think that people are really that ignorant about the consequences of their actions, and really just don't give all that much thought? That they might not be malevolent, but they might just not have thought things through to their inevitable conclusions. And then I think, well, is not thinking things through to their inevitable conclusions bad? Is it evil? Is it inherently... It's lazy, which certainly isn't a virtuous thing, but once again, forbearance could help with that. Caring about others to the point of being able to live with those sorts of weaknesses, and perhaps just have nice, easy, civil conversations on the matter might be more useful, especially for those of us that don't want to have someone's preferences crammed down our throat at the point of a gun. So, I need to learn to tolerate people that have these sorts of opinions. And I need to care for them, even though I may think that they're not very caring themselves. Even though I think that they don't deserve it. Even though I think that ultimately somebody who would wield the government in my face is the same kind of a person as would put a gun to my head to tell me to do something, were he to actually have the courage, the wherewithal, the resources to do so with impunity. Maybe these people aren't completely hopeless. I don't know. Maybe I'm just too conflict averse. I just want us to get along. I just want us to get along. I want to be able to do my thing and let you do your thing. And under the condition that we don't infringe upon the rights of each other, I think we should be able to live and let live. And I hope that you do too. So now that we're about an hour and a half in, we are going to have an intermission. We're going to have an 8-minute intermission, beginning here in a few seconds. Look forward to seeing you guys on the other side. Right, well, here we are, we're back. And now we're at the part of the stream where we discuss education and economics. And we're basically going to be doing this until the stream closes in, I don't know, hour and 15 minutes or a little less, maybe a little more. Either way, the next thing that we have to take a look at is going to be... Oh, it's a little bit late. We're going to be talking about underground history of education. During our last stream, we wound up getting all the way through the preface. So now we're going to be talking about Chapter 1 the way it used to be. We'll start you off with a couple quotes. Whoever controls the image and information of the past determines what and how future generations will think. Whoever controls the information and images of the present determines how those same people will view the past. Take, at hazard, 100 children of several educated generations and 100 uneducated children of the people, and compare them in anything you please, in strength, in agility, in mind, in the ability to acquire knowledge, even in morality, and in all respects you are startled by the vast superiority on the side of the children of the uneducated. This was, of course, by Count Leo Tolstoy in Education and Children. And so John Taylor Gatto begins with an essay entitled A Nation from the Bottom Up. We're going to probably go through 2 or 3 of these essays. Establishing Shot. 50 children of different ages are teaching each other, while the schoolmaster hears lessons at his desk from older students. An air of quiet activity fills the room. A wood stove crackles in the corner. What drove the 19th century school world celebrated in Edward Eggleston's classic The Hoosier Schoolmaster was a society rich with concepts like duty, hard work, responsibility, and self-reliance. A society overwhelmingly local in orientation, although never so provincial it couldn't be fascinated by the foreign and exotic. But when Tench Chautauqua with its fanfare about modern marvels left town, conversation readily returned to the text of local society. Eggleston's America was a special place in modern history, one where the society was more central than the national political state. Words can't adequately convey the stupendous radicalism hidden in our quiet villages, a belief that ordinary people have a right to govern themselves, a confidence that they can. Most revolutionary of all was the conviction that personal rights can only be honored when the political state is kept weak. In the classical dichotomy between liberty and subordination written into our imagination by Locke and Hobbes in the 17th century, America struggled down the libertarian road of Locke for a while her 3 godfather nations, England, Germany, and France, followed Hobbes and established Leviathan states through the 18th and 19th centuries. Toward the end, America began to follow the old world's lead. For Hobbes, social order depended upon state control of the inner life, a degree of mental colonization unknown to the tyrants of history, whose principal concern had been controlling the bodies of their subjects. But the sheer size of an America without national roads or electronic networks ensured that liberty would be nurtured outside the ring of government surveillance. Then, too, many Americans came out of the dissenting religious sects of England, independent congregations which rejected church-state partnerships. The bulk of our population was socially suspect anyway. Even our gentry was second and third string by English standards, gentlemen without inheritances, the rest a raggle-taggle band of wastrels, criminals, Shanghai boys, poor yeomanry, displaced peasants. Benet the poet describes our founding stock, the disavouched, hard-bitten pack, shipped overseas to steal a continent, with neither shirts nor honor to their back. In Last Essays, George Bernanos observed that America, unlike other nations, was built from the bottom up. Francis Parkman made the same observation a century earlier. What America violently rejected in its early republic was the Anglican homily on obedience, set down by English established church doctrine in the Tudor state of 1562. A doctrine likening order in heaven with the English social order on earth, fixed and immutable. The sun, moon, stars, rainbows, thunder, lightning, clouds, and all the birds of the air do keep their order. The earth, trees, seeds, plants, herbs, corn, grass, and all manner of beasts keep themselves in order. Every degree of people in their vocations, callings, and office has appointed to them their duty and order. By 1776, the theocratic utopia toward which such a principle moves was well established in the Britain of the German Georges, as well as in the three North German states of Prussia, Saxony, and Hanover. Together with England, all three were to play an important role in 20th century forced schooling in America. The same divine clock, superficially secularized, was marking time in the interlude of Enlightenment France, the pre-revolutionary utopia, which would also have a potent effect on American school thought. Hobbes and his doctrine of mental colonization eclipsed Locke everywhere else, but not in America. You had to do it yourself. Cut to Abe Lincoln, by the fireplace in a log house. An American, Francis Grund remarked in 1837, is almost, from his cradle, brought up to reflect on his condition, and from the time he is able to act, employed with the means of improving it. I'd like to start with that particular thought and diverge a bit from reading for a while. This was a remark made in the early 19th century. And I would say that as time has gone by, it has become less and less true. Now this is the exception, as opposed to the rule. You may have heard it discussed under a different name. You may have heard it played lip service. But ultimately, well, I'd say that it's fallen by the wayside. The other term that you may have heard this called is the entrepreneurial spirit. If there is an enterprise, there are entrepreneurs. It's about doing things. It's about going and picking yourself up and doing what you have to do. Your life. And you have your own pile of crap that you have to deal with. You have your own set of problems. You have your own set of insecurities. You have your own set of difficulties. You have your own set of everything. But you're capable of dealing with it. This whole, from the time he is able to act, employed with a means of improving it, happens because of two predominant reasons. The first reason is that parents emphasized teaching their children autonomy. Parents emphasized teaching their children responsibility. Parents emphasized teaching their children to be able to see a situation, to have a goal in mind, to count the cost, and to go for it. And with the way school happens currently, you don't count the cost. You mindlessly go. You're not free. You're a slave to the design of others. And there's only people that have learned to function within that paradigm or avoid it entirely, or somehow have taken the red pill somewhere along the way, that don't get caught up in this load of crap that causes us to be impotent in making things better in our own lives, impotent in getting what we want. Back in the early 1800s, I would say that the attitude was a lot more healthy. Lincoln, hardly a slouch as writer, speaker, or thinker, packed 50 weeks of formal schooling into his entire life over the 12-year period between 1814 and 1826. Even that little seemed a waste of time to his relatives, unless you want to argue that those few weeks made a decisive difference to Abe. We need to look elsewhere for his education. Clifton Johnson thinks it happened this way. He acquired much of his early education at home. In the evening, he would pile sticks of dry wood into the brick fireplace. These would blaze up brightly and shed a strong light over the room, and the boy would lie down flat on the floor before the hearth with his book in front of him. He used to write his arithmetic sums on a large wooden shovel with a piece of charcoal. After covering it all over with examples, he would take his jackknife and whittle and scrape the surface clean, ready for more ciphering. Paper was expensive, and he could not afford a slate. Sometimes when the shovel was not at hand, he did his figuring on the logs of the house walls and on the doorposts and other woodwork that afforded a surface he could mark on with his charcoal. Yeah. Kind of like me teaching a stranger boy on a baseball diamond with a stick. You don't need anything more than that. At least not for most of it. Books, place to write, place to solve arithmetic problems. It really, the resources you need to have a good education are very sparse. And the fact that almost 2 decades ago in New York State, $20,000 a year per student was dropped on education, and still, it was difficult for students to find pens and pencils and paper if they needed that kind of stuff. Sickening, absolutely sickening. You give me $20,000 a year, and your kid will have about the best education money can buy. Which is interesting because Most of the money wouldn't be going to actual educational materials. Most of the money would be going to finding opportunities for them, carting them all over the place, doing travel, getting a chance to see people, meet things, and do real things. No. Paying for room and board in places. They can work with people that do real things and get a real contextual understanding of how the world works, as opposed to being put into an institution that attempts to fabricate an alternate reality, a prison into which you put kids for 6 to 8 hours a day. In Lincoln's Illinois and Kentucky, only reading, writing, and ciphering to the rule of 3 were required of teachers. But in New England, the business often attracted ambitious young men like Noah Webster, confident and energetic, merely pausing on their way to greater things. Adam Goroski, mid-19th century traveler in our land, took special notice of the superiority of American teachers. Their European brethren were, he said, withered drifters or narrowed martinets. Young people in America were expected to make something of themselves, not to prepare themselves to fit into a pre-established hierarchy. Every foreign commentator notes the early training in independence, the remarkable precocity of American youth, their assumption of adult responsibility. In his memoir, Tom Nichols, a New Hampshire schoolboy in the 1820s, recalls the electrifying air of expectation in early American schools. Our teachers constantly stimulated us by the glittering prizes of wealth, honors, offices, and distinctions which were certainly within our reach. There were 100 avenues to wealth and fame opening fair before us if we only chose to learn our lessons. Overproduction, overcapacity would have been an alien concept to that America. Something redolent of British mercantilism. Our virgin soil and forests undermined the stern doctrine of Calvinism by paying dividends to anyone willing to work. As Calvinism waned, contrarian attitudes emerged which represented a new American religion. First, the conviction that opportunity was available to all. Second, that failure was the result of deficient character, not predestination or bad placement on a biological bell curve. Character flaws could be remedied, but only from the inside. You had to do it yourself, through courage, determination, honesty, and hard work. Don't discount this as hot air. It marks a critical difference between Americans and everyone else. Teachers had a place in the process of self-creation, but it was an ambiguous one. Anyone could teach, it was thought, just as anyone could self-teach. Secular schools, always a peripheral institution, were viewed with ambivalence, although teachers were granted some value, if only gratitude for giving mother a break. In the southern and middle colonies, teachers were often convicts serving out their sentences, their place in the social order caught in this advertisement of Washington's day. Ran away, a servant man who followed the occupation of schoolmaster, much given to drinking and gambling. Washington's own schoolmaster, Hobby, was just such a bondsman. Traditional lore has it that he laid the foundation for national greatness by whipping the devil out of Washington. Whipping and humiliation seem to have always been an eternal staple of schooling. Evidence survives from ancient Rome, Montaigne's France, Washington's Virginia, or my own high school in western Pennsylvania in the 1950s, where the teacher's personalized paddle hung prominently at the entrance to many a classroom, not for decoration but for use. The football coach and, if I recall correctly, the algebra teacher customized their paddles, using a dry cell battery to fashion devices similar to electrified cattle prods. Something in the structure of schooling calls forth violence. While Latter-day schools don't allow energetic physical discipline, certainly they are state-of-the-art laboratories in humiliation, as your own experience should remind you. In my first years of teaching, I was told over and over that humiliation was my best friend, more effective than whipping. I witnessed this theory in practice through my time as a teacher. If you were to ask me now whether physical or psychological violence does more damage, I would reply that slurs, aspersion, formal ranking, insult, and inference are far and away the more deadly. Nor does law protect the tongue-lashed. Early schools in America were quick with cuff or cane, but local standards demanded fairness. Despotic teachers were often quarry themselves, as Washington Irving's Legend of Sleepy Hollow warns us. Listen to the fate of schoolmaster Thomas Beveridge at the hands of the upper-class Latin school in Philadelphia 11 years before the Revolution. He arrives, enters the school, and is permitted to proceed until he's supposed to have nearly reached his chair in the upper end of the room, when instantly the door and every window shutter is closed. Now shrouded in utter darkness, the most hideous yells that can be conceived are sent forth from 70 throats, and Ovid's, and Virgil's, and Horace's, together with the more heavy metal of dictionaries, are hurled without remorse at the astonished preceptor, who, groping and crawling under cover of the forms, makes the best of his way to the door. When attained, a light is restored, and a death-like silence ensues. Every boy is at his lesson. No one has had a hand or a voice in the recent atrocity. In the humbler setting of rural Indiana, recreated by Eggleston for Hoosier Schoolmaster, 1871, we can easily see that the passage of more than a century and the replacement of rich kids by farmer sons and daughters hasn't altered classroom dynamics. When Ralph looked round on the faces of the scholars, the little face is full of mischief and curiosity. The big face is full of an expression which was not further removed than second cousin from contempt. When young Hartsook looked into these faces, his heart palpitated with the stage fright. There is no audience so hard to face as one of school children, as many a man has found to his cost. While Ralph was applying to a trustee of the school committee for this job, a large, ugly bulldog sniffed at his heels, causing a young girl to nearly giggle her head off at the delightful prospect of seeing a new schoolteacher eaten up by this ferocious brute. Weary, discouraged, shivering with fear, he is lectured. You see, we ain't none of your soft sort in these diggings. It takes a man to boss this district. If you get licked, don't come to us. Flat Creek don't pay no insurance, you bet. Takes grit to apply for this school. The last master had a black eye for a month. So, it was possible, and indeed viewed as a normal part of life and a good thing, to be able to call teachers to task for being despotic or for whatever. Having fair teachers was important, and having a classroom of students being able to beat the crap out of a teacher due to the teacher being bad was normal. You don't hear all that much about that kind of education nowadays, because the whole purpose of the teacher nowadays isn't to teach anymore. If the purpose of the teacher were to teach, they would teach. If the purpose of the teacher is to homogenize students and to tame them, so to speak, to cause them to become less of a nuisance, or to cause them to not make a disruption, to cause them to bend over and take punishment, to cause them to be submissive. You certainly wouldn't expect that kind of behavior in school today. And the fact of the matter is, I don't really have any problem with it. If a teacher is bad, it's not like he deserves anything. If a teacher doesn't teach, the expectations were completely different. Expectations were completely different, and guess what? People managed to get educated just fine back then. Indeed, if we look at the level of literacy of 5th graders, you wound up having minimum 96% literacy. In fact, the figures were more along the lines of 99.6% literacy, with literacy being defined as essentially being good enough to have a graduate degree in English nowadays. None of the stupid, oh, well, that means you got past the 5th grade level. Yeah, you got past the 5th grade level, but in 5th grade they were doing real stuff. If you look at the kind of readers that were available for students, the 5th grade readers were not easy material. Of course, it was just expected that students get through it. Didn't matter whether it was easy or hard, you just go through it. You just do it. Part of the curriculum. You better be able to discuss Shakespeare. You better be able to discuss Locke. You better be able to understand the foundations upon which your culture is predicated. And if it means difficult text, well then that's difficult text. You're done gonna learn it. But no more. And now you wind up having people struggling with, the dog played in the sun. Where did the dog play? In the sun. Who played in the sun? The dog. The dog played in the sun. And then when you wind up having 5th graders that can barely remember that crap, likely due to the fact that, they checked out a long time ago. Due to the fact that they see exactly how futile and stupid this stuff is. How insignificant it is. I mean, students aren't stupid in that regard. I mean, they know when something's worthwhile and when it's not. And then you compare it to what would have been expected at earlier points in history where an education was actually really, really good. I mean, at least for me, it's kind of disconcerting. My wife and I were homeschooling our kids. And by homeschooling, I mean giving them some stuff to do, helping them through it, and generally then going to allow them the autonomy to go places and do things and experience life. You want to report me for neglect? Go on. Bring it. We'll see who winds up having better kids at the end. I mean, coddling and institutionalizing your kids is not in their best interest. And if people have a problem with what we're doing here, well then I'll move somewhere else. Because giving our kids a proper education is something that matters to me. You want to talk about investing in the future? Invest in your children. Invest in the education of your children. No, don't worry. You'll have somebody to take care of you in your retirement. And that somebody will definitely be independently wealthy. That somebody will have learned to provide value for the world and will have established for themselves at least financial independence by the time you retire. They'll have the right attitude. And the attitude is more important than any other thing. I'm going to do this. I'm going to learn this. And then applying that to something of actual significance is important. I think we've said enough on that matter. Now it's time to go to our final piece, which is profit, loss, and discovery. Which is basically why it's okay to have profit and loss in what you discover by it. In a world of endless possibilities but limited resources with which to try out these possibilities, in a world where many people have business ideas but it's not clear which of those ideas are good ones, in a world where no single person even knows how to make a pencil, much less predict what new products, processes, and technologies will best serve people's needs a year or 5 years from now, in such a world we need some means of sorting out the good ideas from the bad, for discovering which products and processes actually do serve us better than others. We need free markets because they give us such a means of discovery. Profit and loss. It is an imperfect means to be sure, but it is the best available to us. Hence, here is the second of 3 principles of spontaneous economic order that account for why we need free markets. In free markets, profit and loss help entrepreneurs discover the most value-creating uses of scarce resources by providing them feedback about how well they are serving others. Profit rewards value creation, loss punishes value destruction. So that very simple piece on profit and loss explains nearly everything. Now, please be patient in the meantime. I'm going to need to take a short break to deal with something that just came up. Right, well, here we are. Time to see if I can get this overlay to work again. Looking for a particular piece. Unfortunately, I couldn't find it for you guys, but I'll try to link it in the description if I remember. But I may not remember after we get through this whole economics thing. Anyhow, here we go. In free markets, profit and loss help entrepreneurs discover the most value-creating uses of scarce resources by providing them feedback about how well they are serving others. Profit rewards value creation. Loss punishes value destruction. This chapter explains what profit and loss are and what information they communicate. It lays out the indispensable role they play in helping entrepreneurs discover how to create value for others. It distinguishes admirable profit from blameworthy profit. It explains that profits are more important as guides to future actions than as rewards for past action, and draws conclusions for public policy. What profit and loss are and what they mean. Let's start with this question to frame the discussion. How much profit is too much? I'd like readers to answer for themselves before reading on. I'll come back to it soon. Many people think that profits for one person must come at the expense of another. The roots of this belief may be in Marxism, based as it is on the now discredited labor theory of value we talked about in Chapter 1. On this view, profit is ugly because it can result only from exploitation. It's the difference between the objective, labor-determined value of the capitalist product and the wages he pays his laborers. Because the laborers who produced it are the sole source of the product's value, they should be paid the whole value they create, but they aren't. The capitalist exploits them to the amount of his profit. Consider a simple example. Suppose you are the capitalist owner of a tractor factory. In a year you buy $4 million worth of inputs, steel, tires, glass, copper wire, and so on, that your workers assemble into tractors that you sell for $5 million. According to Marxist theory, your workers have created $1 million worth of new value. You pay them, however, only $900,000. Your $100,000 profit was all created by the workers, but you did not pay them for it. Your profit means you exploited your workers. You live as a parasite at others' expense. Shame on you. If the labor theory were correct. But it is not correct. Consider the implications of the subjective theory of value, which supplanted the labor theory in the marginal revolution. Because the value of a good is subjective. Because different people value different things differently. Exchange can be and is, except when we make mistakes, value creating for both parties. As long as each person gives up what she values less for what she values more, exchange creates value for both. Each person gets more according to her values only when the other person also gets more according to his different values. In the tractor factory example, the wage rates the company must pay emerge from competition among workers for jobs and competition amongst companies for workers' services. The workers value their wages more than the time and effort they give the tractor factory, and the tractor factory values the workers' time and effort more than the wages it pays. Both sides benefit from the exchange. Whether the factory makes profits or losses is irrelevant to this fact, except that if losses go on for too long, the wages must cease altogether. Voluntary exchange is a positive sum. Wealth is created through trade, as long as we judge people's wealth by their own subjective valuations. One man's gain in free and voluntary exchange means another man's gain. On this view, profit is a very positive thing. It results not from exploitation, but from creating new value for other people. Exactly what are profit and loss, and where do they come from? To begin with, We should always keep them together in our thinking, like two sides of a coin. Think of the market process not as a profit system, but as a profit and loss system. Think of business people not as profit makers, but as people who risk loss in the hope of earning profit, and who frequently just make losses. The future is always uncertain. No one is guaranteed a profit. Here's the definition. Profit or loss equals yield minus cost. Yield minus cost equals profit or loss. This is the broadest definition of profit or loss. In everyday terms, it is the difference between what we get out of an effort, its yield, and what we put into it, its cost. If that difference is positive, it's profit. If it's negative, it's loss. Yield, properly understood, comprises not just the monetary yield. People care about innumerable things other than money, such as working conditions, hours, how satisfying and interesting the work is, and so on. To get a full picture of yield, then, we should pay attention to non-monetary benefits also. But non-monetary benefits are hard to quantify, and most people do care a lot about the money they make, so for now let us restrict our thinking about yield to monetary yield. The money part of yield is total revenue. It is the money customers pay the enterprise for its product. Cost is total cost, everything they spend or otherwise give up, such as alternative uses of the owner's time to produce that product. Consider the elements of this difference one at a time. First, what determines an enterprise's monetary yield? Is total revenue in a free market setting? The size of the monetary yield is determined by the customers who buy the enterprise's products. Customers' valuations of the good or service determine the monetary yield to the entrepreneur. Customers will pay for something only what it's worth to them or less. What they'll pay for the entrepreneur's output approximates the value of that product to them. So the entrepreneur's total revenue reflects the amount of value she has provided her customers. Note that the value of a product to the customers is almost always more than what they have to pay. At the going price, some people get what they consider a decent bargain. Some get what they consider a great bargain. Hence, total revenue is a conservative indicator of the value the business provides to its customers. Now, what determines a business's cost? As we discussed in Chapter 2, all costs are properly understood as opportunity costs. The values of the best opportunities foregone when an action is taken. The cost of production, then, is the next best uses of all the resources used in production. It is the value of what does not get produced instead. Profit or loss, then, is the difference between the value an entrepreneur produces for customers and the value of the resources she uses in doing so. The arithmetic is simple, isn't it? But look at what a profoundly important fact about enterprise it reveals. Entrepreneurs make profits by increasing the value available from resources. That is, by creating value. On the other side of the coin, when entrepreneurs make losses, they destroy value. Let's illustrate with an example. Suppose Alice develops and produces a new line of women's sportswear. She incurs a variety of costs. Among other things, she must rent space, purchase cloth and thread, rent or purchase sewing and cutting machines, buy electricity, and hire people to help her. All of those productive resources could be used to produce other things whose value is reflected in the price she must pay for the resources. For each resource she uses, she must outbid other entrepreneurs who would like to use it for some other purpose. Her space could be used to house some other business. The cloth and thread could be used to produce sheets or upholstery. Some of the sewing and cutting machines could be used to produce other kinds of clothing. The electricity could be used for myriad other purposes, and the skills and energy of the people she hires could also be used in all sorts of ways. Don't forget alternative uses of Alice's own talents and energy. The most valuable service she could provide some other employer is the cost of Alice's being in business for herself. The cost of Alice's sportswear then is the value to the consumers of the best other things that might have been produced with the resources Alice uses on sportswear instead. Okay, that was interesting. Let's see if I produced any value for you guys now that I wasn't able to get any of the pictures to work. Hopefully you guys were able to see what was going on. I'm going to have to go and check that. Anyhow, going back to this. So, here we are. The cost of Alice's sportswear then is the value to the consumers of the best other things that might have been produced with the resources Alice uses on sportswear instead. Now suppose Alice's total cost in a year is $100,000, but her customers pay her $120,000 for her sportswear. She makes a $20,000 profit. How? By taking resources worth $100,000 in their next best uses and transforming them into sportswear worth $120,000. Alice has created $20,000 worth of new value for other people. She has put those resources to a higher valued use than their best known alternatives. Her actions are profoundly creative. Her $20,000 profit is a consequence of her creating at least $20,000 worth of new value for consumers. On this view, how much profit is too much? No amount, right? The more, the better. There can't be too much profit if it's made in a free market. Suppose Alice were to make far more profit than $20,000. Supposing she had taken $100,000 worth of resources and transformed them into sportswear worth, say, $500,000. I don't know how she'd do that, perhaps through design genius. Would her now profit of $400,000 be too much in some meaningful sense? How could it be? Too much for whom? Her customers clearly love her clothing. Her profit would mean that she's produced for them far greater value out of existing scarce resources than others expect to be able to produce. That creativity is a great thing, not a bad thing. It serves others. Or suppose that Alice finds an otherwise useless magic wand that conjures the sportswear out of thin air, so that her cost, other than the cost of her time, is zero. Assuming her customers will pay Alice $120,000 for her products, but she uses no scarce resources of buildings, machines, electricity, labor, and so on in production, Alice's profit would be the entire $120,000 she gets paid, an infinite return on investment of zero. Would that be bad for others? Of course not. In that case, we would have sportswear we willingly pay $120,000 for without having to give up any other goods that we would have had to give up if Alice required scarce resources in order to produce. The more profit, the better for society, as long as that profit is made in a free market. Next, consider loss. Suppose Alice takes resources worth $100,000 in other uses and transforms them into sportswear for which people will only pay $70,000. She thereby has a loss of $30,000. What does this mean? It means she has destroyed $30,000 worth of value to others. In place of a variety of other goods and services worth $100,000 to us consumers, we now have sportswear worth only $70,000. Our society is $30,000 worse off than would have been if Alice had never tried her enterprise. The huge losses that some companies make represent huge losses to society overall. Consider the dramatic true story of Iridium, a sat phone company backed by Motorola that went bankrupt in 1999. The concept was wonderful. A person with an Iridium phone could call from anywhere in the world to anywhere in the world. The phone would beam up a signal from anywhere in the world to one of 66 satellites in low Earth orbit. Computers in the satellites would beam the signal to the satellite closest over the person being called and down to his Iridium phone, or to a receiving tower located near him with a call completed over landlines. It was like a worldwide cell phone system, but with only 66 cell phone towers in the sky. The money cost of the Iridium system was estimated $5 to $7 billion. The company developed communication satellites, launched 66 of them, designed and debugged the software to run the system, built ground towers, negotiated with governments around the world for permission to build those towers and run landlines, and so on. It was a tremendous undertaking. All the resources Iridium used, the time and energy of the sat designers and manufacturers, the rocketry, time, expertise of the software designers, computers, construction of ground towers, the time and expertise of the negotiators, all those resources could have been used to produce other things that you and I would have valued. Instead, they were used to produce the Iridium system. In the end, the system could attract only a few thousand customers instead of the millions it needed to turn a profit. The phones were very expensive, they were large and heavy like bricks, and performed poorly indoors. More importantly, the people at Iridium grossly underestimated the rates of growth and improvement of their main competitor, cell phones. Iridium simply could not compete with them. Around the time of bankruptcy in 2000, they were even preparing to deorbit the satellites, letting them fall into the atmosphere and burn up, rather than clutter the space around Earth with useless junk. Iridium was a stunning technical accomplishment, but a staggering economic failure. Its losses were in the billions. Why? Because it destroyed value. The company took resources valued at between 5 and 7 billion in other uses and transformed them into satellite phone services valued at almost nothing. It was a minor tragedy. Profit, then, is a consequence of the entrepreneurs creating new value. Loss is the consequence of the entrepreneurs destroying value. Larger profits mean more new value created. In the same way that prices reflect information about how badly people need things and how easy or hard it is to produce those things, profit and loss tell how much value people have created or destroyed. Accordingly, there is simply no such thing as too much profit, as long as that profit is made in voluntary free market exchange. The more profit, the better. The crucial social rule of profit and loss is discovery. Because productive resources, such as human talent, machinery, energy, and raw minerals are scarce, whenever we use resources to produce one thing, we thereby give up all the other things we could have used those resources to produce instead. To live as prosperously as possible, therefore, we need to put resources to their most valuable uses. But just what the most valuable uses are at any time and place is uncertain because of the limitations on what any one individual can know. Remember that no one even knows how to make a pencil, and because the future is inherently uncertain. Profit and loss help us to discover what to do to get the greatest possible value out of our scarce resources. Discovery of the best known uses of known resources. Recall the thought experiment from Chapter 8 about getting a railroad line from one city to another when a mountain range lies between them. To build it in the least costly way to society overall, should it be built through the mountains using more engineering and less steel, or around the mountains using more steel and less engineering? For society overall, the best way to go is whichever is the cheapest, whichever way yields the greatest profit. Such calculations of expected profit or loss based on expected market prices are indispensable for helping entrepreneurs discover how best to use scarce resources to satisfy the wants of others. Of course, entrepreneurs' forward-looking estimates of profit and loss are not their only means of discovering the most value-creating uses of scarce resources in an uncertain world. That discovery also occurs through backward-looking calculations of the actual profits or losses they have made on their different projects. In reading that bottom line, they discover whether they have used scarce resources well or badly, whether they have created or destroyed value. Then, if they have enough cash flow to continue in business at all, it's back to their entrepreneurial judgments. What does the profit or loss mean? Why was it different from what was expected? How might losses be cut or profits increased? Realized profit or loss never tells an entrepreneur what to do next. It only makes clear the past project successes or failures in creating value for others. But that feedback is essential in guiding entrepreneurs as they judge what to do next. Discovery of the new and better. Creative destruction. In addition to this discovery of how best to use known means to achieve known ends, profit and loss direct the discovery of previously unknown ways to satisfy human wants. New products, new resources, new productive techniques, tools, and processes. This is innovation, discovery of a real novelty that helps us make more out of life. For innovation also, profit and loss are indispensable. Economist Joseph Schumpeter called this kind of discovery creative destruction. He meant the destruction of goods, processes, and enterprises that once served people well by the creation of new goods, new processes, and new enterprises that serve us better. For example, consider how we light our buildings. The primary means used to be whale oil lamps, and we discovered that petroleum could be refined into kerosene, a cheaper fuel that burned brighter and cleaner. The creation of kerosene destroyed whale oil's role in lighting and with it large portions of the whaling industry. Kerosene's role in lighting was creatively destroyed in turn by the development of electric lighting. Cheaper, brighter, and cleaner. What will creatively destroy electric light bulbs and fluorescent tubes? As of this writing, it looks as if it might be LEDs, but of course it's impossible to tell. Human ingenuity might come up with something else entirely. Consider telecommunications. 50 years ago, when someone in the United States called someone in Australia, the signal of her voice was carried by copper wire, tons and tons of copper torn from the mountains of Peru and Utah and Montana, stretching in a cable across the Pacific Ocean. The call could be made, but the quality was poor and there were delays and clicks as repeaters amplified the steadily degrading signal. Now, when we make a phone call to Australia, the signal of our voice is carried either by an optical fiber cable or by microwave. Optical fiber cables are also stretched across the Pacific, but they carry thousands of times as many calls as copper for their weight, and they're made from cheap and abundant sand. Microwave communications require even less physical stuff. We just bounce the signal off a satellite. The calls are cheap, there are no delays, and the quality is almost perfect. Telecommunication via optical fibers and microwaves is creatively destroying communication via copper cable. Innovation, then, beyond the discovery of how best to use known resources for known ends, is discovery of new and better resources or new ways to use them, or formerly unknown ends. Profit and loss continuously motivate and guide innovation. So why profit and loss are necessary to human advancement? In this role of guiding innovation, profit and loss are not just helpful, they are indispensable. The reason has to do with scarcity and uncertainty. Resources for experimentation are scarce. Lots of people have ideas for new products and processes, but most of those ideas probably won't work. And we don't have enough capital to invest in them all. Machinery, energy, and human talent invested in one idea are unavailable to be invested in another idea, so only some ideas can be tried. At the same time, just what are the best new ideas? Best in how they satisfy others' wants cannot be known ahead of time. Business people can never be certain that their ideas will work. They must try to figure out, to imagine, to project what will work well enough and at low enough cost that the price it earns will cover that cost. Human beings simply don't know for sure what products and processes will fit well into the ever-unfolding future. The following quotation should help make this clear. William Morton said, "The telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. The device is inherently of no value to us." William Morton, President of Western Union, America's largest telecom company in 1876. The wireless music box has no imaginable commercial value. Who would pay for a message sent to nobody in particular? One of David Sarnoff's associates in response to his urgings for investment in radio in the 1920s. Who the hell wants to hear actors talk? The music, that's the big plus about this. H.M. Warner, president of Warner Brothers, on adding sound to movies in 1927. "We don't like their sound and guitar music is on the way out." Decca Records, on rejecting the Beatles in 1962. "So we went to Atari and said, hey, we've got this amazing thing. Even built with some of your parts, and what do you think about funding us? Or we'll give it to you, we just want to do it. Pay our salary, we'll come work for you." And they said no. So then, we went to Hewlett Packard and they said, "Hey, we don't need you, you haven't gotten through college yet." Apple Computer Inc. Founder Steve Jobs, on his attempts to get Atari and HP interested in his and Steve Wozniak's personal computer. Those remarkable quotations show that even people in the best position to predict what sort of products and processes will be worth trying often get it wrong. Who was better able to assess the prospects of a sat phone system than the people at Motorola? Yet they misjudged. More than one major publishing house rejected J.K. Rowling's idea for the Harry Potter series. Think what a dreadful misjudgment that was. In general, it's very difficult to judge what enterprises really will create values for others. Over half of all new businesses fail within the first 5 years. We human beings are woefully ignorant about what to do today to improve our standard of living tomorrow. We have to experiment. Profit and loss guide the experimentation. Entrepreneurs with exciting new ideas peer into an uncertain future and judge the likelihood of developments in consumer tastes, production technologies, labor costs, shipping costs, and all the other considerations they expect to affect the success or failure of the project they're considering. On the basis of past and present prices, they estimate future prices of everything relevant and calculate the project's likely profit or loss. These forward-looking profit and loss calculations guide entrepreneurs to discover which possible endeavors promise to create the most new value for customers. Once entrepreneurs have committed themselves and tied up scarce resources in producing various goods and services, the consuming public needs some means of sorting out the good ideas from the bad. We need a feedback system that tells entrepreneurs when they're actually creating value and when they're destroying it. And that motivates them to do more of the former and less of the latter. Actual realized profits and losses do that job. When a new product or process shows itself unlikely to serve society well by piling up losses, its backers are told by those losses to stop wasting resources on it. On the other hand, when a new product or process serves the public well, profit rewards its backers and encourages them to develop it further. Profit and loss are society's indispensable guidance system for economic activity. The chapter so far has sung the praises of the profit and loss system. Trade creates wealth. Profit results from creating new value. The more profit, the better for society. In each case, I've added a crucial proviso, as long as that profit is made in a free market. The underlying discipline of the free market's basic institutions, private property and freedom of exchange, will direct profit-seeking activities in socially useful, mutually beneficial directions. When government intervenes, however, profit may come from seizing wealth rather than creating it. Where governments transfer property from those who own it to those who don't, or restrict the freedom to engage in mutually beneficial exchange, or fail to enforce contracts, or where government ownership allows someone to pollute or deplete what everybody owns, then profit can be made at the expense of others. Such profit-making merits not praise, but blame. The crucial factor for distinguishing the good kind of profit from the bad is the mutual consent of the parties involved. Such interactions occur by what German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer calls the economic means, free and voluntary exchange. In contrast to the economic means are what Oppenheimer calls the political means of transferring goods without the consent of those concerned: taxing, restricting, granting monopolies, licensing, subsidizing, and the like. When political means are used, it's not necessary to get the consent of those one deals with. Those possessing government power simply compel others, often harming them thereby. We should endorse and celebrate profits that are earned in free markets, because they come from creating value for other people. We should condemn profits made through the political means because they come from transferring rather than creating value, and they provide misleading signals about where human effort and other resources should be applied to help humanity flourish. Before we close this discussion of profit and loss, I want to acknowledge the concern that sometimes profits or losses earned in a free market are simply unfair, and therefore that such profits or losses or the actions that lead to them should be restricted. To return to the last chapter's discussion of price gouging, for example, consider the high profits made by merchants who sell bottled water or generators after a hurricane for 5 or 10 times the normal price. Those profits don't seem fair. The store owners have done nothing brilliant to merit those high profits. They just got lucky. And they got lucky because others got unlucky. Why should the economic system reward them? Some ask the same thing about the large profits made in recent years by oil companies. If prices go up just because of increasing demand from India and China and through no foresight or hard work of the oil companies themselves, why should the economic system reward them? On the loss side, we might claim that it's unfair for firms to be driven to bankruptcy by economic forces beyond their control. Why should the economic system